Welcome back to part two of our deep dive into the historical, theological, and cultural collision between traditional hymns and contemporary worship practices across the globe. In part one, we tracked the seismic rise of the worship wars, exploring how a countercultural revolution in the 1960s exploded into a massive global phenomenon. This movement was powered by a distinct Pentecostal genetic code, as modern music successfully bridged a massive cultural divide to deeply engage a searching younger generation. However, an urgent question remains. In the rush to make worship culturally accessible, what did the visible church inadvertently leave behind across these turbulent decades? In this second installment, we shift our focus from historical explanation to an upfront structural critique, systematically analyzing the problematic erosion of traditional liturgical intentionality. Discover how modern service designs are failing everyday workers in their Monday to Friday vocations, and map out the digital frontier, rewriting what it means to gather. Despite its immense popularity and missional efficacy, the contemporary worship movement faces significant theological scrutiny regarding its ability to provide long-term formation for individual believers. To understand why this happens, we must first confront a deeply systemic issue, namely the profound and ongoing problem of liturgical intentionality within modern corporate gatherings. Despite its immense popularity and missional efficacy, the contemporary worship movement faces significant scrutiny regarding its long-term theological formation, sparking critical debates among church historians. A foundational critique of the movement is that what most participants and leaders define as contemporary worship is ultimately determined by a very narrow focus on musical style alone. In ideal liturgical settings, a skilled worship designer selects and arranges musical elements with explicit intentionality, systematically guiding the believer through a deeply profound, multi-layered formative arc. Moving from adoration into deep confession, experiencing pardon, and expressing thanksgiving, pastoral research clearly indicates that this intentional paradigm remains an exception rather than the institutional norm. The far more common institutional reality is an instinctive, pragmatic mindset focused on basic emotional management, where worship leaders routinely sequence selections to wake individuals up completely. Transitioning them into high-energy emotional states, leaders settle them into a passive posture for the sermon and ultimately send them home feeling temporarily uplifted and satisfied. While this description may sound uncharitable, it represents a highly understandable approach for leaders who have been thoroughly insulated from church history and historical liturgical purposes. Even in contemporary churches that attempt to maintain a traditional order, the congregation rarely connects the music team's actions with historical, highly structured liturgical objectives. Instead, a pervasive, unspoken assumption exists among both laity and clergy that the opening musical segment is simply a preliminary element designed to capture attention for the sermon. Consequently, the entire preparation for the word is evaluated almost exclusively through a consumeristic lens, its specific ability to hold short attention spans and manipulate collective emotion. Under this framework, the historic liturgy of the upper room is completely marginalized, often relegated to specialized, low-attendance services for the older or more dogmatically rigid demographics. The corporate gathering is systematically stripped of its historical architecture, refined instead by whatever mechanics make the sermon or the individual emotional experience attractive to massive audiences. The reduction of liturgy to an emotional prelude undercuts the foundational reality that corporate worship is the heartbeat of the church, permanently weakening historical formation. Historically, communal gathering was designed to offer intensive experiences of divine grace, which in turn functioned as the indispensable fuel for the expansive scattering of believers. Liturgy operates as a deeply formative practice, systematically shaping the imagination, habits, and dispositions of workers for their weekly labor throughout the global marketplace. Consequently, any systemic deficiency in the nature and execution of corporate worship will ultimately fail these individuals in their God-given weekly vocational endeavors entirely. A glaring omission within contemporary worship design is the frequent failure of practitioners to consider or comprehend the lived weekly experiences of the workers who fill pews. Because the modern song repertoire and service structure focus so heavily on therapeutic escapism, workers are rarely led to perceive how their professional labor relates directly. This creates a tragic irony. Weekly professional work is a fundamental, divinely appointed reality and stands as the primary vehicle through which the church joins God's mission. When songs, prayers, and structural flow ignore this reality, they foster a sacred secular divide, implying God is only present during the emotional highs of a musical set. This contemporary fracturing stands in stark contrast to the liturgical architecture of the early church, where ancient Christian communities frequently brought literal fruits of physical labor. Furthermore, they intentionally took their worship services out into the public square, processing through streets to actively consecrate their local commercial areas and marketplaces openly. The early church therefore presents a compelling, highly integrated model demonstrating that daily work and corporate worship must be rightly understood as intrinsically related and mutually formative. Liturgy was never meant to be a refuge from the world of labor, but rather the very place where that labor is offered, sanctified, and sent back out. The contemporary worship music of the early 21st century has evolved into a sprawling multi-genre ecosystem that no longer relies on a singular acoustic blueprint. The visible emergence of leaders from vast ethnic backgrounds has given a powerful, unspoken validation to an entirely new generation of writers to step forward boldly. While deep appreciation must be maintained for historical hymnody, a critical evaluation reveals a stark sociological reality regarding the underlying cultural soundscape of traditional Protestant hymns. Rich and doctrinally profound as these classical texts are, the underlying musical and cultural soundscape of traditional hymnody remains distinctly and visibly homogeneous throughout history. In contrast, the unfolding diversity of modern contemporary worship music continues to usher in leaders and writers from an incredibly broad, highly diverse demographic spectrum globally. This ongoing diversification helps dismantle the Eurocentric monopoly on liturgical expression, effectively allowing the global church to experience a multi-ethnic reflection of corporate praise. The common argument that Christian worship expression once possessed a uniform, static template for liturgy is thoroughly debunked by modern historical and biblical scholarship today. Recent New Testament studies demonstrate with clarity that primitive Christianity was never a single uniform entity, nor did it possess a singular monolithic theological framework. Rather, the Apostolic Church was essentially pluriform from the earliest traceable records, operating across vast geographic distances, distinct linguistic barriers, and differing cultural expressions. Because the historical sources reject the notion of a single uniform apostolic faith, it is extremely unlikely that early worship gatherings were identical or uniform. Operating across cultural distinctions and diverse theological emphases, their ancient liturgies were necessarily diverse, reflecting a wide array of local expressions and distinct traditions. Therefore, the modern trajectory toward musical and cultural diversity is not a departure from ancient roots, but a reclamation of the pluralistic precedent established. The rapid proliferation of diverse musical styles has accelerated structural division within local congregations, subsequently creating deep generational fragmentations across previously unified bodies. Rather than leveraging sonic variety to build unity, many modern churches have adopted a marketing strategy that segments their communities strictly by demographic preference. This operational model effectively divides a single local body into 5 distinct generational cohorts, deeply damaging the intergenerational fabric of the community at large. While musical style is ultimately only one component of generational friction, it remains an incredibly volatile flashpoint, making songbook alterations feel like existential threats. Local leadership teams generally navigate this stylistic tension using 3 distinct strategies, each carrying distinct institutional costs that can permanently alter structural church dynamics. The mishandling of these stylistic transitions has frequently resulted in fractured leadership teams, split congregations, and painful denominational divorce across the local ministry landscape. The contemporary anxiety surrounding new musical forms suffers from a profound historical amnesia, as leaders often treat current conflicts as an unprecedented modern crisis. Pastors often forget that every generation has fiercely contested musical evolution, compiling lists of complaints claiming the music is far too new and lacks beauty. Critics argued this novel music generated unnecessary disturbances, causing indecent behavior and placing an exaggerated emphasis on instrumental performance rather than godly, edifying lyrics. They claimed this innovation was entirely unneeded, viewing the movement as a mere commercial contrivance designed to extract money and monopolize valuable time inappropriately. Labeling the new musicians as young upstarts and loose characters, these institutional leaders expressed deep anxiety over the apparent collapse of orderly corporate praise. The profound irony is that this statement was adapted from an official ecclesiastical document drafted in 1723 to protest the introduction of timeless traditional hymns. This historical precedent demonstrates that institutional anxiety over musical evolution is a recurring cycle, proving that worship wars are an inherent feature of developing faith. Toward intergenerational unity and musical multilingualism, the prevailing organizational trend at the dawn of the 21st century points decisively towards systemic segregation along generational lines, threatening true ecclesial unity. If the church is to maintain its structural and theological integrity, modern Christians must intentionally resist this fractured momentum, stepping outside their microcultural comfort zones entirely. Cultivating a shared liturgical space is an absolute prerequisite for achieving true ecclesial unity, preventing communities from dissolving into isolated special interest groups. Adopting an absolutist stance on either side of the stylistic divide creates an ideological echo chamber, representing an elitist and deeply short-sighted historical posture. This framework ignores the theological reality that the divine presence remains actively at work among modern believers, continuously pouring out fresh songs to articulate ancient truths. Conversely, asserting that an exclusively contemporary repertoire is the only way forward overlooks the immediate spiritual needs of older generations inside the church. It rashly discards massive theological and aesthetic contributions, subsequently severely limiting the musical vocabulary available to future generations, leaving them spiritually malnourished. To counter this fragmentation, communities must champion the concept of musical multilingualism, moving past the natural boundaries of an individual's primary heart music. A profound spiritual transformation occurs when a congregation raises a new generation to be musically multilingual from early childhood, developing an innate capacity for deep expression. Repertoires must intentionally tap into the deep well of true songs, drawn impartially from ancient church history, the classical reformations, and compositions birthed just last week. While specialized small groups serve a practical purpose, absolutely nothing can replace corporate worship as the primary catalyst for deep multi-generational connection and dialogue. Leadership must equally honor the presence, wisdom, and distinct devotional needs of older brothers and sisters, so the various generations learn to see, value, and submit to one another. The contemporary liturgical landscape faces a dual reality, navigating unprecedented digital disruptions while simultaneously managing a phase of deep institutional maturation across all modern ministries. Modern technological shifts are forcing a profound theological reckoning regarding gatherings, even as contemporary songwriters rediscover ancient templates to ground their newest musical compositions. The modern reality of corporate worship was permanently altered by the sudden arrival of the global pandemic, forcing immediate closures of traditional face-to-face services everywhere. This systemic crisis forced religious groups to execute a rapid adaptation, instantly shifting their corporate services onto the digital screen to broadcast weekly liturgies online. This catalyst triggered a swift, widespread institutional adoption of media technologies as leaders rushed to learn the mechanics of broadcasting interactive platforms. As leaders adapted traditional rituals to the spatial confines of the digital screen, profound theological questions emerged regarding what it truly means to gather. The global church faced a mandatory theological reckoning. How must a community understand in practical terms an authentic religious gathering entirely mediated through digital networks? Moving into the 21st century, contemporary worship entered academic maturation as the production infrastructure advanced light years beyond the simple setups of the late 1990s. This brought an ironic development. Many modern writers have begun retuning older historical hymns, bringing a renewed sense of historical weight to contemporary catalogs. Furthermore, the massive phenomenon has finally attracted serious academic scrutiny, with ethnomusicologists and liturgical scholars focusing intense, rigorous research on its global dissemination. Despite this maturation, stylistic tensions remain the most visible fault line, defining a local church's culture and directly shaping its practical theology today. Each community must ultimately wrestle with the same mandate, discovering how to construct a formative liturgy that honors depth, engages culture, and unifies the body. The worship wars remind us that our structural approaches to corporate praise are never neutral. They actively shape the spiritual imagination of the next generation. Does your current corporate worship style genuinely form you for your weekly vocation, or does it merely function as a temporary emotional escape from it? Are we building cross-generational sanctuaries of true unity, or are we quietly fracturing the church into highly isolated demographic target markets? Join us next week as we pivot to historical theology and dive deep into the Auburn Affirmation, unpacking how a single 20th century document exposed fracturing fault lines. If you want to continue exploring the deep intersections of history, liturgy, and Christian thought, make sure to subscribe to Theology Today on YouTube right now. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our weekly deep dives into the profound ideas and movements shaping the global church landscape today.